Good evening. My name is Margery Gans, and I'm a member of the board of the Writers' Room of Boston. I'm delighted that you could join us this evening for the October interview in our virtual series, Writers' Room After Hours. This began in 2023. For anyone new to us, the Writers' Room of Boston is a co-working space in downtown Boston for any and all writers, both established and emerging, who just want or need a quiet place to write. The room is open 24 hours a day, and it provides desks and silence and the quiet companionship of other writers. We've been serving the writers of the greater Boston area since 1993. During and since the pandemic, the room has been offering online resources, including this interview series, monthly Reading from the Room series, which is bringing writers in to just read briefly, and online writing groups with prompts and discussions. This interview series began when we decided to expand the time we get to talk more in depth with individual writers and people associated with books and arts. We hope to speak with people with a wide range of expertise. We also now have in-person occasional open houses where we welcome anyone curious about the room, and programs for members, including a draft and dialogue, which is an informal meeting where writers have time to write, share, followed by dinner and drinks, and a fiction feedback group where writers present their work and group members get to ask them questions. So if you'd like to know more or have any questions about the room and its programs, please check out our Facebook page, Instagram posts at the Writers of Boston, and our website. The website has photos, announcements, and it's where you can find recordings of the past readings from the room and past interviews. We would love to have new members. We have different levels of membership, including a virtual membership for anyone who can't easily make it into the room in Boston. And if you're interested, please check out our website, which our wonderful tech person will be putting in the chat. Series is made possible by grants from the Mass Cultural Council, Boston Cultural Council, and we also rely on friends. So if you enjoy this program, please consider making a contribution, and you can use the donate button on the website. Also, we will be recording this reading, and a replay will be available on the website. Tonight, I am speaking with Tuan Phan. I met Tuan in a Zoom class a few years ago in the fall on Zoom, and I so enjoyed the short stories that he was working on that I knew that I wanted him for readings from the room. He did read for us, and then it just seemed obvious to invite him for a full interview to talk about his wonderful memoir and his upcoming short stories. The name of the memoir is Remembering Water, and he will tell you the name of the short story collection. So, to introduce him, Tuan is a Vietnamese American teacher of literature, and he is currently, well, right now he's in Bangkok on vacation, but he was born in Vietnam and left in 1986 when he was 8 with his family as part of the second wave of boat people refugees. This memoir, Remembering Water, is about his family's departure and return to Vietnam. It won the Panther Creek Book Award in Nonfiction and was published by Hidden River Press in 2023. His upcoming collection, Gills and Other Stories, will be published by Texas Tech University Press in the spring of 2026. So welcome, Tuan, and please join us. Wonderful. So we've talked a little about this interview, and there were some things that he wanted to talk about, but I'm just going to start. I put together a bunch of questions, and what I'm also, oh, and if you have audience members, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and I will check toward the end. We'll go to about 8:30. I'll check toward the end to see if there are any questions. But I'm going to start with kind of a general question about memoir. And I'm wondering if we can make our video bigger, but I'm not sure how we can get on the main screen, but whatever. Um, so one of the things about memoir that sort of fascinates me is people write about local places, they write about their lives, but a wonderful memoir like yours also makes it universal. And so that, even though you're talking about yourself and your family, it's something that we all can relate to. And what I noticed in particular for me was that you do that by referring to things we all share. So there's food and there's weather and sounds. It's a very sensory memoir. And I'm wondering how you thought about that process of, or whether it just came naturally, sort of local to universal.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Marjorie. It's nice to chat with you again. Um, I think for the process of writing that memoir and including, I guess, very quotidian details and the day-to-day aspects of life in Vietnam, as I remembered it as a kid, but also life in Vietnam as I lived it when I came back. Um, I'm not sure why the focus on that. I felt like part of the what I chose to remember or what stuck out for me um, the arc of the memoir is that my family left um, the country as refugees. We escaped, and then I grew up in the States after a year in the refugee camps. But part of what I remember the most, or missed the most, oftentimes were the very sort of day-to-day details of living there. Whether it's like just playing games with crickets, I wrote a part of a chapter on making crickets fight each other as a kid, and that's part of the one of the childhood games that we played. Or whether it's just like living, in a very kind of riverine kind of city through the monsoon season and what that's like and having family around you, the food that we ate, the life on the sidewalks that we experienced. Those tended to be the things that I missed the most. And so I think my memory when I was writing about it in terms of like recalling, my memory picks those details up the most. And when we came back, or when I came back to live in Vietnam, and I was starting to take notes of the changes and differences between now versus then, it was also a comparison of those little details, the details of how maybe the monsoon rains have become a little bit more intense now. The flooding's a little bit more intense than what I remembered. Um, so I think I think that, for like there's several reasons why quotidian details made such an important part of the book. Um, but certainly, I feel like it's what I grabbed onto and held onto the most, and what was most important to me. But I also think it's a what I wanted to do with a memoir was to write about what it felt like to live as a kid there versus and also what it feels like as a person, as a young adult, or in this case, adult person now, who lives there in Vietnam.
So, I mean, the memories, did you sort of, what am I trying to, did you sort of rely on that felt sense of memory? I mean, in a sort of technical way, did you ever rely on photos or journals or notes, or this really was all what you held in yourself?
A combination of those. I think part of it was what I held in myself, and the I think for a refugee who leaves the country without kind of choice, um, memories are really important because I think we hold on to those details because we've lost them, right? We've lost the place, we've lost the location, we've lost the country. So I held on to them very dearly, and I think that um, I also sort of tried to find those details in the stuff that I was encountering in America. This is part of what I wrote about as well. It's like that idea of, I was such a fan of Mark Twain and Huck Finn because details of life on the river were sort of in parallel. At least what I was reading, I was picturing the Mekong Delta, and visiting
Hmm.
my folks there, which we would do quite frequently. That's where my father's family is from. So as I would layer images and sensations of kind of playing with my cousins, in the river delta, and on that river island with what I was reading with Huck's experience. So I think there's, on the one sense, it's sort of like I held on to them so because they were so dear to me. Secondly, I think I was kind of experiencing them in writing and literature, in American literature that I was reading at the time. So as a developing very young writer, I was already kind of like keen on using language to try to capture that somehow. And yes, I think we also, I mean, as memoir writers, we also try to use other things to try to recall and capture them. So when I came, and then there were photographs that I ran into when I came back to the Delta many years later, when I first came back, 21 years after leaving. So those were great sort of catalysts for details and a lot more vivid memories. Um, and the location itself. I think when I first came back, I was writing about how there were certain memories that were dormant and only became alive and came back to me because I came back to visit Vietnam. And so it was just seeing, for example, the apartment where I grew up in Saigon, like that just triggered a whole, even just the drive getting there and going over a bridge on a motorbike, it just brought all of this rush of memories. And they were incredibly vivid. Whether or not they were accurate, I'm not really sure, but they were certainly really vivid. And that idea that I hadn't lived those memories for a long time, but they only came back because I was back in Vietnam.
Mm.
So that was something that I wanted to write about as well. That idea that memory can be triggered by certain kinds of very small details or certain almost kind of physical experiences, like just going cresting a bridge on a motorbike was one of those where it just triggers like the synapses and it brings on a flood of memories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You you mentioned this may be related. Do you want to say any more? You mentioned in the email exchange we were having um, that you thought about what it was like to write about a place when you were actually present in that place versus when you were remembering the place. And
Yeah.
were you in different places as you wrote the book?
Yes. Although primarily I was in Saigon.
Hmm.
Um, I took a year off. So at the time, right before writing the manuscript, I was teaching and working in Hong Kong, and I was making frequent trips to Vietnam. And then I thought I would take a sabbatical year to just do a project. And I wasn't sure whether that's going to be a memoir or a collection of short stories or a collection of essays, whatever it was. But I wanted it to be kind of a book length manuscript. So I took that year off and I was back in Vietnam and then I started writing, whatever the manuscript was. It started out as a sort of a collection of reminiscences and recall. So I was writing about my past in Saigon while I was there in my present. Um,
Hmm.
and there were some details that I had collected over notes over the years in terms of like, my own memories of it. So that kind of existed. And then I was also at the same time writing about the present day Vietnam that was there. And I think that the writing is different. I think it's certainly it's in some ways it's strangely more vivid to write about the place as you lived it um, because it's just, it's been kind of like percolating through your memories and your thoughts and it's kind of made the rounds, as it were, like inside your imagination. And so writing about it in that sense was more vivid. And then the strange thing was that as I was living in Vietnam and as I was writing about the present day aspect of it, I found that I was starting to lose some of my memories of
Hmm.
Vietnam. And maybe that's just because you're living there, you're in the present day, and you're kind of like anytime you're in a place and you're a resident there, I think you start to lose a kind of I guess, sensuousness or a sensuous appreciation of what you're like. You take things for granted, right? Like you go through your routine and you get this and you don't kind of elevate each of those kind of moments to the memory in the way that you maybe would if it was so meaningful to you earlier. Yeah, it's a strange kind of experience, but I found that as I was finishing the manuscript, that some of my earlier memories of Vietnam were starting to sort of not be as powerful for me, whether it's emotionally or whether it's just as not as vivid. And then the city was changing, so drastically, even while I was living there, that I find writing about it was like trying to pin down something that was constantly moving, trying to pin down water. It was just kind of moving and passing all around you. So it was about more, the attempt was more impressionistic. You have to try to sort of capture that sense of flow and a sense of change rather than say, this location had this experience in it and it would always remain that way. It'll never be, and certainly is never going to be for Vietnam. It's such a quick changing place right now. But yeah, I thought it's an interesting, and then oftentimes I found myself writing about memory itself, like writing about the process of
Mhm.
remembering, writing about the process of forgetting, and then re-remembering. So it was fascinating for me to kind of live in Vietnam and write about it, about my past with it and my present at the same time.
It's funny because I wouldn't have thought of this, but you mentioned synapses and sort of the way our memory can get evoked by very sensory things. And
Mhm.
I wonder if, as someone who is writing a memoir, if you have to be aware that if you're living in the same place in the present, all those sensory responses now have to respond to the present. So I'm not a neuropsychologist, but I mean, I
Yeah.
wonder how much room there is for us to hold on to the old memory while we're experiencing life in the present. Um,
Yeah. I think
yeah.
that's a great way to describe that the trouble with trying to live in the past while existing in the present in a place like that. And I wonder if certain places that have, a strong sense of an ancient past or a historical past, if their inhabitants have issues with that, because you can't live in both in such a kind of full way. Oftentimes you have to kind of make a decision, as you said, like um and I feel like that was oftentimes the case with me. I wrote about that as well. That idea that I lived in a city and while I was just kind of meandering through the city, I could oftentimes kind of lapse into the past and how my family might have experienced that past or how I had experienced that past many years ago. But at the same time, I think there's a kind of a richness in that that I would want to continue to experience if I were to come back to Saigon and visit that or live in the city, because I think that I mean that's an essential aspect I think of being humans is that we carry a kind of our memories and our past with us, and for me it was such an essential thing um, to have a sense of Saigon's past and Saigon's and how it used to be at the same time as living there and seeing how it is currently. Because, I think that the city's changing a great deal and it has changed a great deal. And what it's lost in some ways is actually quite sad and quite important for me to at least acknowledge in the writing as well as in my own life. Just the tree-lined avenues, the ways that certain like places have kind of been demolished for urban high rises, and the city is changing and it's becoming more prosperous, but it's also lost a great deal of its kind of natural, I guess, elements and natural surroundings. So I wanted to kind of acknowledge that. And one of the things I wrote about and thought about too was that I'm glad I came back 21 years after I left, because if I had come back maybe another 5 years later, like if I came back like
Oh,
26 to 27 years, I would have missed a lot of the triggers of my past. Like there were certain tree-lined avenues that are no longer there. They're just completely gone. Um, and I would have experienced a very different Saigon. It would have been like coming back to a completely different city. Whereas in this case, I was coming back to a city that had some remnants of what I held dear to me and what I can remember. And that triggered a lot of the memories that I still held.
That's actually really interesting that things change so fast. And again, you mentioned that, that the memories that you have because they are so sensory and so connected. I mean, your theme is water, goes
Yeah.
runs through the whole book. And and that you were saying also almost as if someone in who was 21 now couldn't write the same memoir, just simply hasn't got the experience. It's not available to them. And so we all would pick a time when we say, okay, I'm going to write a memoir now. And
Mhm.
but all of that, I mean, sort of like the war, it changes. But you really, I think, do a beautiful job of writing about the way Vietnam has changed. And again, I think that's something I can certainly relate to it in the United States. I mean, there are places that stay the same, and I'm from New York City, which, always looks like New York City. But
Mhm.
but what you describe, I think, is really powerful, and it makes me think about where when we choose to write the memoir will shape the memoir we write. And
Yeah, I agree. And I think that part of me also is like projecting into the future about future memoirists and this generation of writers and what they'll observe and what they'll remember about their own childhoods. And I think I think it could be very different because I think in many ways, and I wrote about this as well, is that when I first came back and I compared my own childhoods to my nieces and nephews, whom, they'd never seen they've never grown up with a younger version of me, of their uncle, right? But they're raised on iPads and they all kinds of social media and the digital world that they're immersed in. And this is true in Vietnam as it is everywhere in the world. Um, but their parents had such kind of feral, wandering childhoods, like we
oh,
were all from the Delta, and my cousins in particular grew up and lived in the Delta, and to get to school, to high school, they would be ferried across the river, or our aunts would ferry them across the river. And it's just such a life that is sort of connected uh, and endures, I guess, in some cases, the land and the weather and all of the elements of this kind of natural life of living in the Delta. And their kids' experience are very different. So and the idea of like this digital experience of like half of your life or more of your life is spent on the digital realm and on social media and things like that, and how it's disconnected and very different from a kind of life that, yeah, the kids of my generation in Vietnam growing up with playing with crickets and, experiencing like we live right next to the river and, and we're out there and kind of experiencing that and seeing that every day. And how different that would be and how the memories would be different too. So I don't know. I'm very curious about, the next generation of writers and especially memoirists
mhm.
and how that could fundamentally change that recall and what they remember, because I think when you're kind of curating your life on social media, there's such a track, obviously, of like your experiences, and it's visual and it's everything and it's filtered. Um, what does that do to the memory? I'm not really sure, right? Or what does that do to the act of like wanting to capture and remember? For me, like not having Vietnam and living in America made it so important, so crucial for me to kind of like try to remember and just to kind of be nostalgic, even as a kid, about like I was so homesick for my
Mhm.
first years in America, and that home was Vietnam. And eventually I grew to like sort of love the places and I lived in America. But that sense of homesickness for a location, I wonder if it's different for kids now, like Vietnamese kids that, because I taught many kids that go abroad for their university experiences and but they, they're Vietnamese and but yeah, it's interesting for me to kind of consider what the future holds for such writers. I'm also raising, a toddler and he's going to experience life in different places. We're living in Taiwan now, and we're back in Vietnam for most of the holidays. So I'm just kind of like thinking about how the memory is formed for someone like him. He's just 2.5 right now, and whether or not he starts to remember certain things, and whether or not being a digital person, which is what I he's going to eventually be, right? That is not something that we can't that us Luddites can keep them from, what that will mean. So yeah, these are all things that I'm very, very interested in. But I think it's certainly for the book, I wanted to make it be as grounded as possible in place and in location and in the weather and just the experiences of living in a place as viscerally as possible.
I, so I don't really have I don't know how to formulate a question, but one of the things, of course, you write about is going from Vietnam to America. And you were 8 years old, and you weren't told right away what was happening. You were told that you were visiting, and then the trip got longer and longer and longer.
Yeah.
And and you describe what the adults around you are doing. And it was, to me, it was kind of amazing because you're this, I think you, how did you have to work to get inside your 8-year-old self? Or again, this is sort of like, was he just living inside you? Because you give us your 8-year-old self and we're in it. I mean, I don't feel like I'm in a grown man's self looking at an 8-year-old. I feel like if the 8-year-old could write the memoir, he would be writing it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
because it's an 8-year-old's take on the grown-ups, which I also found interesting. I mean, sometimes you do some reflecting about what they might have been thinking or going through, but really, I think what makes that piece so powerful, and in some cases very sad, very moving, is that you're 8. You're like the 8-year-old author. I mean, was that a choice or did that just come naturally or?
Yeah, that's a deliberate choice. And it's interesting. I have had a chance to read parts of the memoir to some of the schools that I'm taught in, and then sometimes very young kids will come and attend, and I'll just make a executive decision to, make sure I read some of the passages from my like about my younger self as a refugee, and the kids love it. So one of the sections I think I mentioned was like what we ran into on the escape, we were really quite helped by running into an oil rig, and then that description, I saw that as an 8-year-old self as like this creature that just appeared and I had never seen before. And that was both kind of wondrous and kind of scary. And how that experience was for my 8-year-old self. And of course, not knowing that it's an oil rig, like, there's no context in which I would know what an oil rig would look like, especially when you're in this tiny boat looking up at it, or
Yeah.
looking at it from a distance at night. Um, so it was a very deliberate decision to do that. And I wanted to, I mean, I think in many ways it's helped by reading and having read a lot of young adult books and understanding the voice of a person who's trying to kind of piece it all together. And then also kind of recalling how how I reacted at the time, because as you mentioned, my parents told me that we were going to visit my grandfather's home in the Delta, which is the his home is in on a river island. So back then we used to have to take a ferry and then or a canoe actually, and just kind of take a long time to get. And then there are other kind of passing over little rivers, even just to get there. Um, and they were just saying that we're taking a watery route and kind of a roundabout way to get to it. Um, and then I just remembered being so scared and being so sad when I found out, and I was convinced that we were going to die when it was revealed that we weren't, that we were actually going to try to escape the country. And it wasn't like feeling sad about leaving the country. It was just this feeling that we're not going to make it. And but at the same time, I also remembered, at least afterwards, that the horrifying aspects of being on that boat were I was kept protected from, because my parents, you know, they deceived me essentially. But I mean, it's a very humane kind of deception that they practiced, um and they kept up the ruse, for throughout most of the journey. So I had no idea until I would say probably like the third day, when it was very clear. And I remember there were like friends of the family, and I also remember like getting a sense that it wasn't right, because I remember their reaction when my parents told me, and I was like, this, why are they reacting like that? So like even as an 8-year-old, I could sort of see there were cracks in that, but I never doubted my parents. I just kind of went along with it. And that's the voice that I wanted to get. That's the voice that I wanted to capture.
Mhm.
And that voice of kind of innocence and the voice of like complete trust in your parents. Because I did have complete trust in them. And I think it was that made me feel kind of protected. And in some ways it was kind of their sacrifices, that they also kind of try to hid their fears and everything as much as they could throughout that whole journey. And so I never had to kind of, I don't remember the hardest parts of that boat journey. Like, my mom told me horrifying like details. But I don't remember any of those. I do remember some of the most beautiful aspects of it, like, and strangely, right? Like we saw um flying fish, and we had like the boat's captain, use like maybe drove into them to catch some fish on the journey. And it was like an amazing sight to kind of see it. And because my father was friends with the captain, he after the storm had subsided, I sat in the captain's cabin with him and the captain, and we saw, we just looked at the ocean. And I had never seen ocean, in the middle of the ocean like that. And it was wonderful, right? It was like at the same, like I didn't feel horror at seeing that. And I think that was uh I kind of that's due to my parents kind of protecting me throughout. So I wanted to write about that as well. It was part of the deliberate decision to write it from an 8-year-old's perspective for that aspect, was to make sure that I kind of acknowledge my parents' protection of my innocence throughout that whole boat ride.
And I think, what you do when you do that, because there are kind of allusions to what it was like for the grown-ups, and may or may not horror, but I think I've never been a refugee, but I've read enough and I can imagine. And again, there are things that you witness as an 8-year-old and give to us that indicate this is not, they're not living it the way you are. Um,
Yeah.
and I think partly what's powerful is you give us a child and we see how the child kind of, if the child's protected, it's just a different experience. I mean, you don't have to experience that horror. And some children do different experiences, but that's a lot of what feels important about that. So I just wanted to ask, because I didn't really plan this, but we had talked about you reading a piece of it. Was there a piece that you had
Sure.
chosen? Because maybe we could sort of pause and hear some of it, which would be great.
Okay. This is not about the boat experience. This is about coming back to live in Saigon and kind of re-experiencing the monsoon season. So I'll read a little bit of it. It won't be too long, and kind of cut off kind of abruptly a little bit because it's part of a chapter, and I wouldn't want to read the whole chapter for you, but it's just called
Mhm.
Monsoon Season. Um, in October in Saigon, the deluges come, and all romantic notions of the monsoon rains are washed away. Black clouds roll in from the south, gathering mass like an invading horde. The air gets charged and clammy. Something in it tugs at the hairs in your skin. The leaves and branches start to rise in electric currents and turn horizontal. When the downpour comes, it comes quickly, and in minutes the streets are overwhelmed. Motorbikes get caught mid-journey. Drivers pull over and wait out the flood under cafe awnings, watching the streets turn to rivers, rivers to seas of roiling waves. It could feel like the East Sea has flooded back into the city. Saigon's bordering rivers and canals take on the sheen of oil slicks, with a styrofoam burger box or plastic wrap floating by, adding texture. Bags clog the drains, plug exit routes, and make the flooding worse. Evenings, discards from houses and shops tangle with water hyacinths and drift downriver, gathering debris as they go. The Saigon River becomes an engorged python, its belly fat and distended, its pores leaking sluggish gray onto banks of concrete that can barely contain its misshapen form. The sudden onslaught of water could be exciting, though. By my second rainy season here, I started treating motorbike driving through downpours as a sporty hobby, a sort of motocross mixed with jet skiing. I made bets with myself on the rides back. How can I get home safely while avoiding the most urban obstacles? What parts of my clothing could be still kept dry by the time I get to my street? In the relentless rains here, you can play such games to keep the rainy season from beating you. Um, and then I'll just read just a little bit about driving there. At my first turn into Nguyen, the water was already knee deep. The 2 lanes set aside for motorbikes were fully submerged, along with the sidewalks that bordered them. Half the street had become shifting marshland, a rolling, dynamic geology of rushing water, trying to find its way to lower ground. I plunged in anyway, motorbike at half speed, trailing the splash of other motorbikes, watching for moments when drivers ahead of me dipped to know where potholes or unexpected concavities in the road were. Every few blocks, a motorbike would stall out and its driver would jump into the water, wading the lake that was once a road, pushing his waterlogged vehicle towards higher ground. At times, the water was so high that I had to kick my legs up and rest my feet just below the handlebars. It looked like I was joyriding, but it was all to keep the upper parts of my pants dry. Everything else was already soaked. Winghuta Street, which leads directly to my home in District 4, was blessedly raised, but the small alleyways and roads that fed into it were engorged with floodwater. As I drove by, I saw people wading through their half-submerged homes, carrying possessions by the armloads, like ants fleeing a flooded colony. Once home, the shower was the site of my first visit. I washed my ankles and scrubbed my skin to clear all residue of the suspicious gray water I had motorbiked through.
What's Now that I'm hearing you read it, even though I've read it, I come back to a question that's sort of I've been thinking about throughout the interview and before. Water is just everywhere. And then you mentioned again, sort of reading Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn and the Mississippi
Yeah.
River was, and you grew up in a very watery place, came back to a watery place, got to the different place by water. Were you conscious? Did you start out the memory thinking, this is basically a water trip? And the title is Remembering Water.
Yeah.
How did water work in your memory as you started the memoir, as you continued it?
It wasn't necessarily intentional as a sort of symbol. I think it's almost kind of baked into the identity of a Vietnamese person.
Mhm.
And the title, if you translate it into Vietnamese, is nhớ nước. So nhớ for remember is also to miss. So like
Mm.
to be nostalgic for, to miss, to hunger for something. And nước is water, but it also means country and nation. So the title in Vietnamese is actually for I meant, and this is kind of funny because I when I read from the memoir to my students who were in Vietnam. So I had a reading at my school that I taught there in Vietnam. And halfway through in talking about it, some of my students who, they're Vietnamese, they got the understanding. They understood that it was a kind of a pun name, like a punny name, right? Right. Like if you knew the Vietnamese
Mhm.
translation of it, you would knew that it actually also meant like missing your country or missing
Yeah.
your birth nation and things like that. So it's a very rich kind of element. And so I think I didn't intentionally make it so that I would be writing so much about water. But I think because I was surrounded by it, because the boat journey outside leaving the country was surrounded by water, because the river island that my grandfather lived on, is surrounded by river water. It just started to filter through a lot of the descriptions of the pieces that I was writing, the memories that I was having. And I think it was useful also as an element to describe, I think, a kind of a kind of existence of a refugee or a person in exile trying to recall, trying to remember where they came from, and trying to remember that past because it's elusive. I think it's an attempt to try to gather and hold something that doesn't always that you can't always grip. And I wanted to capture that project in those images. Um, so yeah, I think it just became infused throughout the rest of the book. And then it made sense to title it Remembering Water. I kind of bandied around with a bunch of different kinds of titles. The titles didn't come until after I finished one kind of draft of the manuscript. Um, but I did some other punny names. Like I think there was like playing with Saigon as a pun, which I think is like it is somebody's memoir. Like there's a Vietnamese American writer who wrote like Sigh
Mm.
gone. So I think I toyed around with some of those kinds of names, and then I thought, no, actually, it makes sense to have Remembering Water, and it operates in a wonderful kind of translation complexity in terms of its translation into Vietnamese as well.
Yeah, the Vietnamese title, as you translate it, sounds wonderful. And it sounds very close. That feels very close to what you wrote, that it's got both country and water, that it combines those things. It really works.
Yeah, thanks. In some ways, it'd be too obvious if it was in Vietnamese. That's the other thing, right? Like I think if
Hmm.
because it would just be like, oh, you're missing your country, right? I think it's
Hmm. Yeah.
and it also like that would be the primary kind of meaning, and then the secondary meaning would be remembering water because it's sort of like remembering water seems like it's too artistic a kind of phrase, you know what I mean? So I think like but like so the reading it in Vietnamese would have almost kind of a too obvious. So I actually kind of like it as an English title because again, like I said, like some of my students when they found out they're like, oh, wow, okay, I got it. You were kind of playing a little trick there. And I
Hmm.
appreciated that discovery for Vietnamese readers and speakers.
Well, and I think, again, for me reading it as an American, you know, I also grew up around water. I grew up on the East Coast. It feels really important to me. And so I have a sense, and, but I have friends who live out in the desert. And so
Yeah,
water just doesn't mean to them, but the land does in a way.
yeah,
And water runs through your book and not just in Vietnam, but as you pointed out in your reading, the fact that you could bring Mark Twain into your book and make it connected says something about you, and it says something about your writing that connects to a lot of different audiences, and tells us that even when you were in the United States, you remembered water, which
yeah.
that's, yeah, it's great. Um, so looking at the time, I want to ask you one more quick question about memoir, and then if we have time, I don't think there's any questions in the chat, but I will check. Uh, yeah, she's got the Writers Room website and she's got the name of your short story collection coming up. So, but quickly before we get to the short stories, um, how did you decide to write a memoir?
Well, it was a bit roundabout, as I mentioned. I wanted to write a manuscript length something, and you and I both have talked about how, we were in a workshop for writing short stories, and and I think my tendency has been to sort of write short pieces. And when I first came back for that sabbatical year, I was writing reflections, and they felt sort of like personal essays. In fact, some of them were essentially personal essays. And the more I wrote such short pieces, the more I realized that I think I really wanted to capture the sense of returning after having left as a refugee. So I had a kind of a narrative arc in mind as I
Mhm,
started to write more and reflect more about coming back to Vietnam. So the natural shape of that probably was a memoir. I felt like I came around to that idea, halfway through the writing. And then I realized that I didn't want to just have like small pieces. I wanted to just have some kind of narrative arc. And the arc would be what it was like to leave, um, what it was like in the year being in the refugee camps, and then what it was like to return. So departure and return, that was essentially the
mhm,
arc. And I think even after having written a lot of that, I took another year to try to arrange and kind of like play around with that arc a little bit more, because a memoir does need to have, it
mhm,
needs to have a kind of narrative, propulsive kind of structure, and which essays don't have to have, and short stories don't necessarily have to have at least more than the structure of of the short story itself. So it took me a little while to try to organize it and then to rewrite or to add parts that I thought were missing. The part that was missing the most was the year in the refugee camps.
mhm,
So I went back and I expanded that, or I wrote with a lot more detail, and I interviewed my mom to get her memories of that refugee year experience, and she gave me a lot more details, and that was a great decision. I felt, because my memory of it was so spotty, and it was so peppered with like bright, beautiful things, that in hindsight, I just realized how incomplete that was.
mhm,
And getting her story and getting her worries or fears of that year, and some of the sadness that she experienced, and then being able to sort of reflect upon that, and infuse the story a little bit more with her story was really important to me. So, I mean, I don't even think that it's like a full memoir in many ways. Like there are bits and chapters of that I almost kind of feel are thematically linked, but are not necessarily linked to the
mhm,
narrative, right? Like there's a long chapter in my uncle, um, that can feel a little bit out of place in terms of the narrative structure of it, because he went to America on his own years before we did, and he had a different kind of experience in life in America. But I wanted to keep it there because, well, I mean, what other chances will I get to kind of remember my uncle and his
mhm,
experience of kind of being in limbo, stuck between countries, in
mhm,
America, and living in America and not becoming a citizen all of those years. Um, there won't be another opportunity. So I wanted to just make that be there. Um, and I'm glad that I did, because I feel like that added so much to the experience of, living in America while kind of your heart is still, in many ways, still in Vietnam. And that paralleled to some degree my experience as well. And also he was the literary kind of person in our family, like both of my parents are doctors, and it was so important for me to sort of have conversations with a person who was just very keen on literature and loved Thoreau, and had it
mhm.
all. So he was a person that I wanted to capture.
So short stories. When
Mm.
you and I were in the workshop, it was a short story workshop. And I remember your reading, and that was partly why I wanted to get you into these series. Um, what's different for you writing short stories? Because some people might have taken their memories and infused them into short stories, which probably is something I would do rather than try to write a memoir. You've done
Yeah.
both. Can you just talk sort of about the difference as a writer?
Hmm. In some ways, I had some problems or troubles with the form of fiction because my instinct has always been to write kind of what's happened as viscerally and as possible. So in some ways, like the memoir was a kind of a natural, or the personal essay was more of a natural form for me. Um, but I've really grown to appreciate the freedom that short stories have and the idea that you can change what really happens. So you can start like sort of, I guess the genre now is called autofiction. So
Hmm.
you start with details that were real. And there are some stories in the collection that's going to be published by Texas Tech um, that are very much autofiction, that like whose narrator is essentially another version of me. Um, but the stories change and you have a little bit more leeway and freedom and less kind of reticence because these are fictional characters. And even
Mm.
though, like the father looks a lot, sounds a lot like my dad, and but I think like it changes, and I think you can alter. And I think having that freedom was both kind of liberating, but also kind of fearful for me to kind of say, okay, well, I can really alter and change the story. And the story that has become the story's title is Gills is my first kind of attempt at writing kind of magical realism, and
Mm.
I enjoyed that. The concept, the idea was that the rainy season came through, and then upon its departure, two children grew gills, and two school children grew gills on their feet. And then sort of what happens after that. So I kind of enjoy playing with, and these are all the kinds of genres that I've read and taught as a literature teacher. Um, and it's kind of fun to be able to kind of play around with writing them. And as you said, like we don't have to think about a long arc. You don't have to think about a full structure and the ebb and flow of a narrative. It has to be contained within that short story. And it has to happen kind of fast. It has to within such a short space. You have to do so much. So I enjoyed that.
So we just have a couple more minutes. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you want to talk about or say?
I can't think of any really. I mean, I think right now my concern has been to just raising a toddler while abroad. I think it's just a fascinating thing. And for me, writing about memory and writing about childhood has like in some ways I kind of almost wish I could go back and like write them because I see now the experience of like being a really, really young toddler and what that's like and forming memories for the first time or forming language. And that's just fascinating to me. So I think, maybe another memoirs in the works or maybe short stories that have very young kids or children's stories. I love that. I'm really looking forward to kind of sharing my childhood reading experiences with Liam once he starts to. Well, we're reading stories now, but they're very simple stories, right? So I'm looking forward to like sharing some longer stories
Mhm.
and book length stuff with him when he starts to be able to understand it a little bit better.
I mean, it's interesting because even in saying that, it's it's sort of you could go back and write memoir after memoir after memoir, and they would all be different. It would all be your life and your reflections, but every
Mhm.
time you got a little bit of a point of view that was different, whether it was through your son or reading someone else's memoir, like you and I were talking that I'd heard about another memoir that was very different from yours. And you
Yeah.
said you'd been reading other memoirs of other Vietnamese authors that, you could sort of hold up your life and look at it from so many different perspectives. So you could just keep on doing this for the rest of your life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, and the last thing I just want to ask, just to sort of give people room to roam around literature, are there any particular people that were your inspirations?
For as like literary inspirations,
Well,
or
for
do you mean just like
memoir or, I mean, maybe not, but I'm just curious because I know you read a lot and, you read a lot.
um like right now I'm reading a novel by Cecile Pin. She's a French writer, French Vietnamese writer, whose work is translated into English. And so uh her novel is called Wandering Souls, or at least the English version. I'm enjoying it a lot. I told you that I've been kind of on a kick of reading Vietnamese diaspora writers,
Mm,
including diaspora writers that are not, American, even though I think like, Ocean Vuong and Viet Thanh Nguyen are so famous right now. But there is such a wealth of different Vietnamese diaspora writers out there. Um, I mean, I think that some of the classic writers that everyone loves, I also love. Like, I love Junpo Lahiri. I think she's a master at the short story. And as I'm like trying to sort of edit and revise this collection, um, I sometimes turn to her to kind of see how she works through an aspect of plot, or how she really subtly kind of plays around with all those elements of the short story. It's great to sort of always have at the ready, like
mhm,
a masterpiece that you can always look at and it's like, oh wow, I can sort of see how that's done. And that's fascinating, and it's at the ready, right? Like you don't have to be a billionaire to possess
mhm,
these masterpieces. They're
yeah.
always kind of there. So I love that. I really enjoy that. There's a Malaysian author of short stories that I really enjoy called Shirley Kao,
Mhm,
and her collection called Ripples is really wonderful for those that are looking for stories that are not about America, or not
mhm,
about like the worlds that we're kind of used to. But she's a wonderful, very funny writer, and very descriptive writer of Malaysia. Yeah, I think those are it at the moment. Hard to find time to write and read these days.
definitely. Well, I
Yeah.
sort of love the idea of sort of having a writer sitting next to you, that you
Yeah.
sort of turn to and be inspired by. I think I'm gonna hold that in my head.
Yeah.
So, we're about out of time, and I just appreciate you so much. And again, to the audience out there, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. And also, just that your short story book is in the chat for anybody. And you said that would be out in the spring.
In the spring or the summer. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if somebody looks at your Facebook page in the spring and the summer, will they be able to find a link and get that book? What will be the way we can get it?
Um, I have a website, I guess, that I'll update
Oh, okay.
once more details come out, but it's just called twanwrites.com.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. So I wanted to thank you. I want to thank our wonderful program director, who is also the tech maven for tonight, Leslie Ostro. And this has been recorded. It will be available on the website. And I see if there's anything else I'm supposed to say. Oh, announcements. The next reading from the room will be on October 28th. Um, And any announcements for reading, the next interview is November 20th with Gish Jen. And then I'll announce whatever future interviews there are. But all the room events, look on the website, and that's about it. So good night. Go back to your toddler or back to bed or whatever. And thank you so much. And maybe we'll interview you after your short story book comes out.
I would love that. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Marjorie.
Take care. Good night.